7 out of 10. You're as good as I am, Mrs. Vo. The woman, a plump fishwife by the name of Carmen Vo, beamed at Naya's praise. Oh, you're such a flatterer, Miss Baraha, she laughed lightly. You never missed during training back in the war and you were a terror on the field. That's because I was using a skill. Without it, her archery was about as accurate as many of the women practicing before her. Between her skill to imbue arrows with divine energy and the equipment that the Sorcerer King had lent her, however, everyone who saw her fighting during the war probably believed that she was as good as her father. After finishing their tour of Mr. Sota's business, they traveled to the harbor district outside of Remyon's walls. There, they visited the wharf where many members of the Sorcerer King Rescue Corps could be found among the fishermen and their families. An archery range had been set up in the empty waterfront where the fishing boats were left ashore overnight. As she watched the wives awaiting their husbands demonstrate their archery skills, Naya struggled to make a connection between archery and being a fishwife. So they process fish and sell them at market. Archery helps them, huh? She supposed that it did make them physically stronger, and being stronger helped with various things. They could carry more stuff without needing help and could stand their ground against regular civilians if push came to shove. The latter wasn't really a factor since the Holy Kingdom was a relatively peaceful place, usually. They once lacked the strength to uphold their justice, but, now, they were in a better position to do so. If what she had seen thus far reflected the state of all of the Sorcerer King Rescue Corps members, then they were all as strong as a regular armsman in a noble's retinue. It still wasn't enough to take on demi-humans alone, but it was fairly substantial in their current situation. Have you seen anything like this before? Naya asked. What do you mean? Say looked over at her. Civilians practicing their combat skills in peacetime. Back before the war, the only time most citizens acted as combatants and honed their skills for potential conflicts was during their time with the army. I can't say that I have, Say said. Everywhere I've been, professional soldiers and civilians don't have overlapping roles. I guess there are retired Imperial Knights in their farms and frontiersmen that might do it. Everyone else spends their whole lives as civilians and they get eaten by raiders if there aren't any soldiers or adventurers around. What about Reistais? I thought that they levy troops from the common folk. They do, but they don't train seriously until after they're called to fight. That didn't make much sense to her. She figured that they would at least have basic army training like the Holy Kingdom citizens did. But didn't they go to war with the Empire every year? How did they stand up to the Imperial army? By outnumbering them, I guess. I think it was usually 4-1 every year at Katza Plains. The Imperial army is mostly cavalry and the Royal Army of Reistais uses pike formations to counter them. Naya wondered how well that worked. The Holy Kingdom's Royal Army once considered countering large cavalry like demi-humans such as Orthrus with pikes, but the result was disastrous. When the time came to test the idea, a single Orthrus ended up charging straight into the regiment of pike, snapping their weapons like toothpicks before slaughtering over 2,000 soldiers with little effort. After that, it casually walked away, stating its disappointment over the lack of challenge. How have relations been with the demi-humans offshore? Naya turned her attention back to the small gathering around her. We must have fished the area heavily to feed ourselves after we lost our stores. We didn't have any boats right after the war, Mrs. Vo said. And the fish got wise to us casting our nets from the shore. Once the catch dried up, we had to rely on whatever the demi-humans brought in to sell. If there were any problems with overfishing, they weren't with us. I see. Has the old dragon been around? Haven't seen her since the war started, the fishwife shook her head. We figure she'll show up when the fleet comes in. She's always curious about what they bring from abroad. When do you think the fleet will arrive in Remyon? Say asked. Assuming the usual weather, they should be on their way north to Argland right now. Once they arrive there, they'll be in port for 2 or 3 weeks before sailing back down to us. You must be looking forward to it. Oh, we are, the women around them nodded and smiled. I'm not sure how we'll explain the war, but the Wind of Remyon has always been a joyous occasion. Will the temples declare a holy day as usual? Naya asked. I don't see why they wouldn't. The Duke's been rushing to fix up the summer palace before then, too. She hoped that she could spend some time in the city when that happened. Say was probably interested in the exotic goods and stories that the mariners had to share, as well. Close to sunset, The fishing boats started to appear on the horizon and the people on the shore cleared up the archery range to make space for them. Shipbuilding was still very much crippled in the Holy Kingdom, and the immediate demand for fishing vessels meant that Rimion's entire fishing fleet was made up of small boats with crews of a half-dozen men, at most. Somehow, those crews recognized Nia long before they came ashore, and the men waved and cheered at her as they rowed into port. Fishermen replaced fishwives as the latter took the day's haul to the evening markets. The owner of the fleet, a wiry man by the name of Enrique who continued to work on one of the boats despite his success, came to join them after making sure everything was in order. "Miss Baraja," he said, "it's such an honor to have you visit us." Nia waved her hands in front of herself. "Ah, please, there's no need to be so formal. I just wanted to see how everyone was doing." "We're doing swell. Things always seem to be looking up, though I guess we were right at the bottom after the war." He said as much, but, just as it was with Mr. Soto, the progress of the people dwelling in royalist-managed lands couldn't be even remotely compared to his success and the state of Rimion in general. "Was what you learned during the war of any use to you?" Nia asked. "The training we took part in sure toughened us up," Enrique nodded. "Rowing boats and hauling fish ain't nothing to us now." "I see," Nia said. "But the Holy Kingdom still has its maritime treaties, right? Even if it's easier to do your work now, the areas where you're allowed to fish are still limited." One of her greatest fears was that some members of the Sorcerer King Rescue Corps would use their newfound strength to bully others into getting what they wanted. She didn't like thinking that way, but, with so many people, it was unreasonable to think that no one at all engaged in undesirable behaviors. "Yes, you're right about that," Enrique said, "but we were still able to learn some tricks." "Tricks?" "It's hard to explain. Little things that help here and there. Some people are better than usual at telling where a good catch is, while others can skillfully bring in the best fish. Others still can sense where dangerous fish with magical abilities are and keep their boat out of harm's way. Stuff like that. After I expanded my fishing fleet, I started organizing the crews, making sure that as many ships as possible have one of each person that can do a certain trick. Overall, it's made things much smoother than before. Once the shipyards start launching vessels that can hold larger crews, we'll do even better. Maybe there really is a skill that makes people go Had the Sorcerer King known this as well? She wouldn't be at all surprised if so. No, he must have known about everything all along. His Majesty's greatness truly possessed depth beyond all human comprehension. On their way back to the Summer Palace for supper, Nia stared at nothing in particular as she digested what she had learned. Coming into Rimion, it felt reasonable to go along with the Conservatives' strategy, building up the strength they required to bring justice to the royalist-controlled lands in the Northern Holy Kingdom. Now, it seemed like every day they spent in preparation was another day that her people in the East were prevented from following the Sorcerer King's wisdom. Say. If people from Hobans came to Rimion, how do you think they would react? The bard glanced at her before snorting and returning her attention to the carriage window. Shocked and angry, but not angry enough to do anything but talk about it. But how can that be? They've been suffering for months while their fellow citizens in the West have been enjoying a normal, no, an accelerated recovery. Because anger is cheap, Say told her. People are angry everywhere and it gets them nowhere. How many rebellions, revolts, or even riots do you know of? Nia furrowed her brow as she failed to think of anything even remotely resembling a rebellion, revolt, or riot. They were unheard of, so much so that she had to think about what the words even meant. "I don't know of any," Nia said. "I only know of one," Say told her. When the Warden of the East, Marquis Elnex, rallied the lords of Baharuth and rejected the rule of a foreign power. That's when the Baharuth Empire broke off from Ria's ties? Well, it's more like I said, they kicked out a foreign power. After the demon gods were defeated, the theocracy wasn't the only group to send people to settle the ruined lands. House Vayself was originally from somewhere in Tarnassus and they used their relatively powerful position to conquer what belonged to some different empire that existed there before the demon gods. Didn't you say that you had problems finding any detailed history from around the demon gods' time? I said that there's a weird problem with our history when it comes to the demon gods. But I know more than human history. The mountain dwarves and the frost giants in the Azalizia Mountains have intact records that the human nations in this region lack. Both of them recognize that humans lived in the lands on both sides of the mountains, and the dwarves even have written records of them, including vaults full of everyday things like trade ledgers and coinage. I see, that's sort of interesting. Riestais always frames the Empire as a collection of rebels. I hear that they do, Say said. But the truth is that the Baharuth Empire is effectively the successor of the previous empire, and Riestais was founded by invaders that took advantage of the chaos after the demon gods. Anyway, what I was going to say is that anger and discontent aren't enough to enact the change that you want. We're not trying to rebel against the crown, though. What the conservatives are hurtling toward is civil war. What's pretty rebellionish. I think you'll be able to find many basic similarities between what's going on here and what happened in Baharuth, even if things don't play out the same way. Naya fell back into her thoughts again, wondering what was required to enact change. Was it money? Power? Political will? Leadership? Maybe it was everything. As much as she hated the idea, Say was right, anger was cheap and did little on its own. Furthermore, she had seen that it could be manipulated, misdirected, and it was ultimately short-lived. In the end, it all came back to the Sorcerer King's wisdom. Weakness was a sin. Strength was required to protect what one cared for and uphold justice, or injustice would be forced upon all that one cared for. What she needed was to figure out what constituted strength in their present situation. But people continue to suffer as I sit here trying to figure stuff out. She couldn't sit still. She had to do something, even if it was a little bit. For supper, she joined Duke de Bonai, Count Vigo, and a handful of other nobles in the Summer Palace's Great Hall. Say assumed her place as a performer. Naya couldn't figure out how the girl could play through dinner without her stomach growling non-stop. Did everyone else go to prepare for the demonstration, Your Grace? Naya asked as she unfolded a napkin over her lap. Most returned to their respective areas of responsibility, the Duke answered. These young lords that you see here are those assisting in the administration of the territories adjacent to the city, plus a few who stayed behind to witness your demonstration. Count Vigo is a guest from the south, of course. I see. Since those present will be most familiar with the matter, what prevented the jurisdictions in Rimyun Prefecture from creating work camps around Rimyun? Practically speaking, I mean. There are both political and economic aspects to it, one of the noblemen at the table told her. For our part, doing anything similar would be interpreted as an attack against the crown. How can the royalists do the same thing and get away with it? I won't pretend to understand what goes on in King Caspion's head, Miss Baraha. I only know how the royalists will use any similar actions on our part against us. The royalists' economic maneuvering also has a clear, political motive. There has always been a struggle for power between the rural regions of the country where the vast majority of the Holy Kingdom's citizens live and the cities that serve as the country's economic and political centers. The royalists are doing what they're doing because they want to weaken the cities and the crown as much as possible, even while supposedly supporting the crown. So the royalists are actually acting in the best interests of all nobles, even the conservative faction? The answer is not so simple, Duke de Bonai said. Our country, nay, any kingdom, has three main social groups. The first is the crown, second, the aristocratic establishment, third, the rural common folk. Each strives to negotiate rights, laws, and contracts that favor their respective positions, and through that balance is the political and economic health of a kingdom maintained. Between the incompetence of Caspond and the machinations of the royalists, however, the processes that create a healthy balance in our country are being reworked and circumvented. Rather than representing any single demographic in the Holy Kingdom, Count Vigo added, the conservative faction first and foremost desires a return to responsible governance for the sake of the entire country. You have seen firsthand the suffering and ruin wrought by the royalists' heedless and unobstructed pursuit of progress. Naya nodded. Maybe every side was thinking that they were doing what was best, but one side was clearly leading the country into an unthinkable catastrophe. As Your Grace says, I see the difference now that I've come to Rimyun, but, according to my associates, the citizens here don't believe the claims of what's happening in the east. That is the unfortunate truth, Duke de Bonai replied. One of the things that we were hoping for was that you would lend credence to our claims. I'd be more than happy to, Your Grace, Naya said. But I was also thinking of doing something else. The Duke washed down a bite of his meal with what remained of his red wine before offering her his full attention. What might that be, Miss Baraha? I'm not sure how effective this would be, so I was hoping for everyone's thoughts on this idea. The city of Lloyds was recently taken over by the Royalists, but how much of its constituent prefecture went with it? A low murmur rose from the nobleman present at her pointed question. The Royalists' policies present a clear and present danger to the area around Lloyds, Duke de Bonai said, and you propose that we take advantage of the newfound awareness of the Royalists' ways in the area to reinforce our position there. Not only that, but, could I bother your grace for a map? Duke de Bonai looked over his shoulder and nodded to a nearby footman. Nia went through her dish as quickly as she could without looking ridiculous. The footman reappeared with a large easel, placing it in front of the main dais. Another footman came behind him and mounted a board with the map upon the easel. Nia rose from her seat and went over to stand beside the stand, taking a proffered wooden pointer and studying the map's details for a moment. She indicated a spot 2 days south by southwest of Lloyds. This is the location of Mr. Lowser's hacienda, she said. What portions of the north coast are still under conservative control? Everything west of Lloyds, essentially, the Duke said. Minus the fiefs adjacent to the city. Then, never mind an idea, Nia told the assembled nobles, this should be our priority. The wooden pointer circled the corridor of conservative-controlled territories sandwiched between the Kingswood and the highway running from Lloyds to Hobans. Count Vigo leaned forward on his elbow and nodded. She's right, Your Grace, he said. Before Miss Baraha's arrival, it was an overextended position that was problematic for us to defend. With the addition of Los Ganaderos, however, it's a strategically critical area. Maintaining a stronghold on that corridor will solve most of the logistical issues that Miss Baraha's people face. By escorting supply caravans coming through that corridor, Los Ganaderos will effectively act as a regular patrol of light cavalry. Everything west of there will also theoretically be secure from any substantial moves by the Royalists so long as those territories are in the way. Nia blinked blankly several times as the Count spoke. Now that he mentioned it, she could understand the value of the outlined area. Before that, she just wanted to speak to the people there to spread His Majesty's wisdom and bolster them against the inevitable advance of the Royalists. What you say makes sense, Lord Vigo, Duke de Bonai said, but how much will this cost us? One must also consider how the Royalists will react to our movements. To that, I would say it doesn't matter. The area's strategic importance is too great to not reinforce. It is undoubtedly. Count Vigo's brow furrowed as his voice trailed off. He remained silent, peering at the map as if it was a venomous serpent. What's the matter? Duke de Bonai frowned at him. I was going to say that it is undoubtedly where the first contest for the North will be held, but what does that mean? King Caspond awarded Lloyds to the Royalists with only half of its constituent territories. What occurred in court that resulted in this outcome? A trap to bring us into conflict? One of the nobles suggested. Or an invitation by the Holy King to initiate conflict, said another. He is in no position to rescind his policies, but this may be an attempt on Caspond's part to weaken the Royalists and regain some of the Crown's power. Several discussions broke out over the table at the same time. Nia tried to listen to all of them at once, but she couldn't make much sense of anything. As the talking dragged on, one of the noblemen near the middle of the left table, a tall, dark-haired scion by the name of Lugo, rose from his seat and raised a hand to call for silence. I am strongly of the mind that this is an invitation, the dark-haired young man said boldly. Consider the results of Royalist management in the north. Hobans, Calintia, and Prat only pay a fifth of their dues to the Crown. The Royalists similarly withhold 80% of trade taxes collected from the towns and ports. If Lloyds is subjected to such a schedule, then the Crown's debts will begin to mount at an unacceptable rate. As blind as he seems to be, King Caspond and his cabinet cannot ignore that. And if they try to, another nobleman said, the Crown will simply cease to function and the Royalists will do as they please. We still control half of Lloyd's prefecture and we have an obligation to see to its proper management. If left to their own devices, those workshops will ruin things just as surely as they have everywhere else and our poor performance will see more of our lands awarded to the Royalists. It seems that we have no choice, Duke de Bonai mused. Which is what makes it such a damnably good trap, Count Vigo said. We may have little choice but to take up this challenge, but that doesn't mean we go into it without a care in the world. What will the royalists do once they detect our activities in the area? That would depend on the plans that we threaten, Duke de Bonai said. Though, once they realize that Los Ganaderos have come fully over to our side and what that entails, well, we may as well do everything short of attacking the royalists outright. From her place by the map, Naya scanned the nodding heads of the assembled noblemen. They already seemed to understand what that meant, which meant that she remained clueless. What does everything entail, Your Grace? She asked. Everything we can do to spoil their prize, Duke de Bonai answered. An increased military presence, diverting resources that would normally go to the city. The latter will likely hurt them the most. One of the first things the royalists do once they establish those parasitic labor camps is charge a toll that encourages anyone delivering goods to the city to sell it to the nearest camp instead. Once they control the supply lines, they are free to dictate industrial production. In other words, the conservatives would be sending half of Lloyd's resources to Rimian instead. The greed of the royalists would be turned against them by opening a sea route to Rimian that offered superior returns. The royalists won't like that at all, Count Vigo said. But do we have the will and the means to deter them should they attempt to press Lloyd's natural trade rights over its prefecture? Natural trade rights, one of the noblemen snorted. They're simply paying the consequences for their malevolent motives. As ludicrous as it is, the dark-haired nobleman said, Lord Vigo's concern must still be addressed. I would not be surprised at all if the royalists put forward such a justification, and we must have the martial might on hand to enforce true justice. While their mettle is yet unproven, to what degree would you say that we can rely on Los Ganaderos, Miss Baraja? Us? Naya jerked slightly as the discussion was suddenly turned on her. I'm confident that we can deal with the royalists on the field, but they have other tactics that we're not equipped to deal with. Such as? Industrial sabotage, for instance. Arson appears to be a favorite method. Then, there was the chain of assassinations that led up to Mr. Lauser's death. They're all activities that require thief-takers or at least skilled foot patrols to counter. Our men are all ranchers, so you won't be able to count on them for urban law enforcement if the need arises. That much, at least, shouldn't be an issue, Duke de Bonai told her. So long as Los Ganaderos can deal with an overt military offensive, we can provide the armsmen for what you mentioned. So long as we can be flexible with our tactics, Your Grace, Naya replied. We're light cavalry, after all. Then it's settled, the Duke smiled tightly. I can't wait to see what those royalists look like when they finally choke on their greed. They spent another day visiting people around the city while preparations were made for the journey to Lloyd's prefecture. That extra day in the city saved them several days' worth of time, however, as their return to the east would consist of a brief sea journey along the northern coast of the Holy Kingdom. Naya, her escort, and their horses joined a group of nobles with 500 men aboard a pair of galleons marked for the amended route servicing the conservative lands in the north. The Duke, of course, hadn't come with them. Appointed to represent the faction in his stead was Lugo, the second son of House Agrella, who was the dark-haired nobleman who had first challenged the efficacy of Naya's forces and promoted the more assertive approach to the problems near Lloyd's. Naturally, he also served as the de facto leader of the men who came with them, which included 4 other scions from the south. Lugo and his fellow noblemen spent most of the journey apart from her until their destination appeared on the horizon. I never liked sailing against the current, he said as he joined Naya on the starboard rail. It almost feels as if the fishermen are mocking us as we creep by. It's still faster than going overland, Lord Lugo, Naya replied. I'm grateful to Duke de Bonai for lending us some ships. She gripped the railing, resisting the urge to shift uncomfortably at the long silence that followed. Had she said something wrong? Unless they were famed artists or local leaders, city folk like Naya usually didn't have interactions with rural aristocrats. She wasn't quite sure how to conduct herself around them beyond being as polite as possible. Additionally, she had a feeling that the nobleman didn't particularly fancy speaking with her. In fact, Lord Lugo spent more time speaking to her company of ranchers. The combination of being a foot soldier with the fact that she was a woman probably didn't do her any favors. Do you think the local administrators will give us any trouble? She asked as the pair drew close. If you mean the ones on our side, problems shouldn't arise so long as there aren't any misunderstandings. If you mean the royalists, most definitely. The question is how they will enact their retaliation. Naya was already well aware of how the royalists did things, so the question was more for the former. She knew that she should probably give the conservatives the benefit of the doubt when it came to their conduct, but the cultures and traditions of the rural elite didn't make much sense to her in the first place as someone from the city. A group of riders bearing an unfamiliar banner arrived at the wharf while Naya's ship was being secured at its moorings. The nobleman and his retainers dismounted and awaited them at the end of the pier. He made his greetings to Lord Lugo, but not before giving Naya a queer look. "Welcome to Bast, Lord Lugo," he said. "You'll forgive our surprise at seeing a pair of unscheduled galleons sail into port." "Duke de Bonai sends his regards, Lord Aston," Lord Lugo replied. "Along with 5 companies of armsmen to assist against any attempts at mischief by the royalist menace." "I see. We were wondering how the loss of Lloyds would be handled. We're making our stand here, then?" "More than that. The royalists will receive none of the fruits of our efforts if it can be helped. An extra galleon has been allocated to the northern coast to divert goods to Rimune." Lord Aston's gaze went to the massive galleons moored at the town's piers. Each had the cargo capacity of 1,000 horse-drawn wagons and could cover the distance to Rimune in a fraction of the time. It was more than enough to see to all the logistical needs of the northwestern coast, and the needs of Naya's people conveniently helped to fill the holds for the inbound trip. The imposition that she imagined her request for supplies might be turned out to be none whatsoever, but Duke de Bonai held no qualms whatsoever using her misconceptions as a bargaining chip. "Our new friends in Lloyds won't like this at all," Lord Aston said. "The people in our territories are already starting to feel the bite of the royalists' tactics, however, so I'm sure we'll have no problems convincing them to deliver their goods here, instead. I suppose we should set aside space for new storage lots in preparation. Hopefully, our trade partners won't mind the logistical disruptions while we sort things out." "Rimune has already anticipated the potential shortfalls," Lord Lugo said, "so you'll have no worries about that." The other nobleman nodded. "Then it seems that the Duke has everything covered. Speaking of which, who might this masked individual be?" "I believe you may know her as the Faceless One." Lord Lugo gestured loosely in Naya's direction. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Lord Aston." Naya bobbed her head. The sound of the wind and the waves filled the silence between them as Lord Aston's scrutinizing gaze ran over Naya. "So this is the fellow who took over Lauser's operations. I never imagined the Faceless One would be a woman." "I didn't take over," Naya bristled. "Mr. Lauser's entire family was killed, as was almost all of the senior management of his hacienda. I ended up with the responsibility of leadership as a result." "Of course," Lord Aston said. "I meant no offense, Faceless One. Just Naya is fine." They moved out of the path of the pier as horses and cargo started coming off of the ships. Naya did her best not to stare as the goods piled up along the wharf. If it was Hobans, desperate people looking for work would already be swarming the area. "How long will it take to move this cargo?" Naya asked. "That's a good question," Lord Aston answered. "We also lack the storage capacity, so we'll just have to clear a yard and throw tarps over everything while we load the ships." "Are supplies for your men included in this shipment?" "Yes," Naya said, "but we just renegotiated our trade agreement with Rimune, so I still have to inform my people of the changes. It might be 3 or 4 days until they start arriving to cart everything off." I'm worried about how the region will handle the shift," Lord Aston said. "Shall we discuss this over lunch? I've already sent some men to arrange for transport to the manor. Bast only has 2 inns, so we'll have to camp your companies around the manor grounds for now. Also, I must ask your men to refrain from straining the region's supplies until the economy has had time to adjust to their presence." "Of course," Lord Lugo said. "We've brought everything that we'll need for the next week with us. Another 5 companies will be arriving within the next week, as well." "Does the Duke expect a war to break out?" "Not quite. We can save that discussion for when we arrive at your manor. The details are lengthy and grim." While they waited for their transportation to arrive, Naya got together with Said, Carlos, Mr. Morrow and Mrs. Diaz. "Should I go ahead to Hacienda Santiago, Miss Baraja?" Carlos asked. "Take 2 squads with you," Naya answered with a nod. "The rest will escort the extra wagons we'll need to lease from the locals. Also, I'm worried about road conditions. We won't be able to use the highway out of Lloyd's and it looks like it just rained." The northern coast of the Holy Kingdom was lined with low ranges of mountains and hills which absorbed the brunt of the inclement weather coming from the north. Conditions could be treacherous as one followed the roads that linked the logging villages in the temperate rainforest. "Will do," Carlos said. "Don't get yourself into trouble without us, ya hear?" With that, the rancher captain turned away and whistled up two of his sergeants. Naya waved and smiled as they rode off. Once they disappeared behind the nearest set of buildings, she turned her attention to Mr. Morrow. "Do you have any information about the Sorcerer King Rescue Corps around Lloyd's?" "Keeping track of our members outside of Rimune Prefecture has been difficult," Mr. Morrow replied, "but I can't imagine that they'd be difficult to identify now that we're here in person." Naya scanned the buildings facing the waterfront, looking for any particularly wealthy establishments. Her followers weren't very gaudy when it came to their operations, however, so she couldn't tell at a glance. "Shall I attempt to locate them, Miss Baraha?" Mr. Morrow asked. "That would take forever without help," Naya said. "I hardly think we need to chase our members around," Mrs. Diaz said. "If people know that you're around, they probably just pop up on their own." That's probably true. When she was minding her own business, members of the Corps usually didn't bother her. Now that she was actively attempting to spread the word of His Majesty's greatness, however, they made themselves known once they realized what she was up to. "We need to prioritize the people who are suffering under the oppression of the Royalists," Naya said. "I'm not sure how we can safely reach them, though." "That shouldn't be a problem," Say said, "so long as the people we send don't do anything conspicuous. It's not like local authorities instantly know who every stranger is just by looking at them. It'll be especially easy to get people from Lloyd's and Royalist-controlled towns. Once they find out there's work to be had here, they'll come running over. Won't that warn the Royalists about what's happening? Maybe if people get questioned about why they're leaving. The summer grain harvests should be starting soon, though, so that probably won't happen. The Royalists would have to notice what's going on in the middle of all those people moving around. It's more likely they'll find out what we're doing here when they realize half of their expected imports have gone missing." She was probably right, but Naya didn't want to get any of her people in trouble if she could help it. "What will we need if our members come to join us?" Naya asked. "It shouldn't be much different from when we operated as an organization during the war," Mr. Morrow said. "However, without knowing the situation of the people in this prefecture, I hesitate to predict the financial burdens that might come with such an undertaking. I'd still hate to leave them hanging if they need us," Naya said. "Can we prepare something just in case things take a turn for the worse?" "I'll see what can be done, Miss Baraha. The nobles will undoubtedly spend at least the rest of today discussing the missive from Rimune, so I'll take the opportunity to find out what I can about the Corps in Bast." "Thanks, Mr. Morrow." Mr. Morrow nodded and went on his way. The aforementioned transport arrived 15 minutes later, consisting of a modest carriage which was kept in good condition, another carriage that looked a bit beaten up, and a small line of wagons. Lord Aston entreated his fellow Signs to join him on the first carriage while Naya, Say, and Mrs. Diaz boarded the second. The companies loaded their baggage onto the wagons and accompanied the caravan on foot. Onlookers lined the streets of the town as they passed, but, as with Rimune, the locals neither looked desperate nor fearful of the irregular event. She wondered how many members of the Sorcerer King Rescue Corps could be found amongst them. "You need money," Say suddenly spoke up. "I know." Naya sighed. The contents of her purse still only contained the remains of her parents' allowance. "That's not what I meant," the bard told her. "I can tell that you don't want to finance your efforts by asking your followers for support." Naya turned her gaze from the carriage window to look at the girl sitting across from her. "It wouldn't be right to ask," she said. "Why not?" "Because it's their money." Naya cringed at the very thought. "They earned it through their own hard work. I have no right to take it from them." "But isn't their success due to you sharing the Sorcerer King's wisdom?" "I just talked." "Anyone can talk. If I didn't do it, someone else would have." Hundreds of thousands of people had personally witnessed His Majesty's greatness, so that was surely the truth. That someone could so shamelessly take credit for the Sorcerer King's wisdom was a vile thought. "So," Say pointed to the Corps emblem on Mrs. Diaz's collar, "that pin, the supplies required to train your people, all of the functions and events that the Sorcerer King Rescue Corps held, who paid for everything?" "That's, The equipment and supplies for our people came from the army because we were fighting as a part of the army at the time. Mr. Morrow figured out the pins, but I told him that, whatever he did, donations and the like shouldn't affect the standing of people in the Corps. As for the events, we had supporters organizing everything. You know, all of those things cost money, right? Requisitioning supplies from the army might have been an option during the war, but it isn't now. If you want to continue doing that stuff, you're going to have to pay for it. Uck. Even if she said so, it didn't feel right. Besides, Say said, you're a moral philosophy, right? Buddhist temples, monasteries, and wandering monks all accept donations for their services. We don't offer any services, Naya said. We don't have priests or anything. They did things a little bit differently and it produced better results than usual, but it wasn't as if what they did was so radically different that one had to undergo mystical training or take special classes. In all of the places that she visited in Rimune, the Sorcerer King's wisdom had simply been applied to workplace culture and the benefits of that culture were felt by everyone that partook in it. If anything, it was all of the successful business owners that promoted the Sorcerer King's wisdom that should benefit from their activities, and they did. I guess we'll have to talk to Mr. Morrow about it, Say said. Why are we dragging Mr. Morrow into this? Because it seems like he has the most experience with managing your organization. He probably already has plenty of ideas for you to pick from. Pick from? Mr. Morrow isn't a boutique. After following the road along a towering forest of black hemlock for several kilometers, they arrived at the manor of Bast's former count. As with every other southern nobleman, Lord Aston had naturally assumed the former ruler's seat upon being assigned the surrounding lands to manage. The manor itself was walled and could rightly be called a castle, albeit a modest wooden one. Naya disembarked and smiled as she breathed in the sharp air of the forested hills. She always felt that she was at her best in such surroundings. Faceless One, a footman called out to her. Your men may camp in the eastern meadow below the road. Accommodations have been made ready in the manor for you and your attendants. She nodded to her men and watched them trot back out of the castle gate. Several other footmen came by to carry her baggage and Mrs. Diaz followed them into the manor. Naya and Say went over to join the Scions, who were marking over the walls and towers around them. It will be impossible for the royalists to advance past this place without taking it first. Yes, well, that's exactly why this castle was built here, is it not? No, Lord Lugo said, I believe this place was built to counter unchecked demi-human incursions. The town is still the keystone of our defense. Just so, Lord Lugo, Lord Aston nodded. If it comes down to a conflict with the royalists, the sea is the key. Whoever manages to blockade the other side successfully will obtain an insurmountable logistical and economic advantage over the other. Unfortunately, we have no justification to impound the royalist ships connecting Lloyds to the rest of the country. They could already be building up their forces for all we know. It seemed that they hadn't deployed proper scouts, much like the royalists that had tried to enter Mr. Lauser's land. In a normal situation, they could rely on merchants for information, but the Conservatives' current strategy would preclude that once it came into effect. Lord Aston, now said, have you posted sentries along your eastern borders? We were discussing just that along the way here, Naya. Calling you by that name feels terribly awkward. The only person I call by their first name is my wife. We usually call her Ms. Baraha, Lord Lugo said. Lord Aston repeated her name several times, narrowing his sea-green eyes. Baraha, Baraha, as in Pavel Baraha? He was my father, Naya replied. I see. Could it be that you've inherited his prowess? That would be a wonder to see. Ah, I'm nowhere near my father's level. You were saying something about sentries? Yes, Lord Aston nodded. Lord Lugo here mentioned that your men would be patrolling the border for us. Huh? Effectively patrolling the border, Lord Lugo said. Since using the highway from Lloyds isn't an option for Los Ganaderos any longer, you'll be transporting your supplies using the rural roads. Those roads are unpaved, so, to save on wear and tear, we should split your supply convoy into 3 different ones. Doing so will also have the effect of patrolling the territories along the way if you have outriders for your caravans. Just how many men are they expecting me to field? She said that she could provide 2,000 if required, but she had only meant for the short term if fighting broke out. Those same men were working as ranchers and patrolling their own lands, after all. Didn't you want to test my forces before they were deployed, Lord Lugo? Naya asked. I already have. You have? The young lord smiled slightly. Combat is not the only method of testing the quality of men, he told her. According to the members of your company, none have been on a sea journey before. Despite this, their mounts were perfectly well-mannered for the entire trip from Rimune. It speaks of the bond between mount and rider, one that cannot so simply be fabricated. Also, from my discussions with them, your men also appear to know their business. I see. That probably explained why he spent so much time with the ranchers. He hadn't been purposely avoiding her, that was just something she had decided on her own. Men, especially noblemen, simply loved talking about horses and hunting and all sorts of violent things. So these patrols you're expecting, Naya said. They're to consist of each convoy's regular escorts, right? That will be more than enough for now, Lord Lugo told her. It's not as if an army can sneak by them if they come by 3 times a day. As promised, our men will take care of things in the towns and villages, so worrying about small-scale infiltration will be our concern. They had already discussed this in Rimune, so why was she acting so surprised? Naya suspected that she knew the answer, however. Between her experience in the war and what had happened after it, she still couldn't bring herself to trust the southern nobility. It was as if she expected that something twisted would inevitably result from her interactions with them. Duke de Bonai's faction has dealt with me honestly so far. Why do I have to be like this? She was wasting her worry for nothing, and the resulting sense of guilt gnawed away at her. Maybe she could learn a thing or two about putting bad things behind her from Say. A young man with the appearance of a butler appeared to announce that lunch would be served within the hour. Naya and Say went to their room, finding that Mrs. Diaz had drawn baths for them and prepared changes of clothing. You're a lifesaver, Mrs. Diaz, Naya said. I just boiled some water, Miss Baraja, Mrs. Diaz laughed. You've always had that way of making little things seem like a big deal. We need to work on that, Say said. You can't interact with these signs the way you're right now. What do you mean? Naya asked. It's like you're speaking to them from way below, the bard answered, and it's weirding them out. I don't get it. The sound of water sloshing on the other side of the divider was followed by the sound of a thorough scrubbing. These guys aren't lords, Say told her. They're mostly second and third sons around your age. As a prominent leader, you're at least around the same standing. I wouldn't be surprised if they think you're above them in this situation. But you talk to them as if you're an ant. An ant? Something like that. You are always apologizing or thanking people for things that you shouldn't be. It's always as if you're doing something wrong or waiting for permission to speak or act. You're acting like a commoner from the city. You keep your head down and try not to offend the powerful and wealthy. These scions we're working with will see and understand why you're doing it, but it's bound to get annoying at some point. Naya stepped into her own tub, frowning at the amount of dirt that had gotten under her fingernails. How could that happen when she was just a passenger on a boat? I thought nobles expected that. They don't even talk to their tenants like that. Not unless they're complete jerks. They don't? In city terms, Say told her, a tenant in a fief is like a minor business partner with some extra obligations depending on their contract. Do small business owners in Hobans act the way you do to the merchant guild or big customers? Not unless they want something. Whenever Naya encountered nobles on her patrols for the Holy Order, they always seemed high-handed and aggressive. Then again, they only came to her when reporting illegal infractions. Maybe Say had a point. If what she said was true, then Naya would consider her own behavior around the nobles pretty slimy. Then how should I behave? She asked. They're all boys around your age, Say answered. It's fine to be a bit accommodating, but there's no need to act as if there are giant walls between you. They have things that they're good at and things that they're proud of, then there will be things that they expect you to know more than them about. Just don't do anything that wounds their pride or might be seen as an attack against their families. You make nobles sound pretty normal. It's not as if they're heteromorphs, Say said. Their boundaries are just a bit different from everyone else's. Oh, and don't sleep with any of them, that's bound to cause problems. What do you think I am? A 15-year-old girl, Naya could almost hear Say rolling her eyes. You're going to be surrounded by young men. You might not even realize that you're flirting, but what you don't realize you're doing will still give them ideas. And if someone you fancy is even a bit nice to you, that might give you ideas. Then, all those ideas carry you off somewhere stupid and that will undermine your standing with everyone. Undermine my standing? That doesn't make any sense. Why would my standing have anything to do with my? That's just how it works. It doesn't have to make sense to you. Wait, does that mean you're aiming for one of those guys? I know they're all handsome noblemen, but... no. An oppressive wave of suspicion rolled over the divider. Nia hurriedly scrubbed herself clean and left the bath. Why was an 11-year-old lecturing an adult woman about men? She couldn't even argue because Say probably had way more experience than her and bringing that up would be awkward. If Nia's father even got the slightest hint of her being interested in someone, he would threaten to snipe him from the rooftops. When they went to rejoin the nobleman for lunch, they found Lord Aston alone in the hall. He seemed surprised at their appearance. "Is something the matter, Lord Aston?" Nia asked. No," Lord Aston answered. "I'm accustomed to women taking longer." Nia laughed weakly. "A habit from military life, I guess. There was always too much to do and not enough time." Was that normal enough? She went to sit beside Lord Aston, though she wasn't sure whether she was supposed to. Say went to take the performer's chair. She didn't look like she was going to eat her, so there probably wasn't a problem. They waited in silence as members of the manor household came in and out of the hall for one thing or another. "Did you bring your staff with you?" Nia asked. "No," Lord Aston answered. "They're members of the former lord's household that returned after the war. The story is much the same across the north, unfortunately. Yaldabouth's forces eliminated the leadership at every opportunity." "At first," Nia said, "we only thought it was happening with the Royal Army's commanders, but the Resistance's logistics were so messed up that we eventually realized that it had to be more than that." "A truly demonic method of waging war," Lord Aston shook his head. "Leaving people lost and directionless, undermining one's will and tempting them into making immoral decisions, forcing captives to commit all manner of depraved acts. I've heard many stories about it since I arrived here. The fiends were not content with destroying our country, they wanted to corrupt its very soul. Even now, there are so many wounds that fester and many more that reopen at just the slightest touch. We don't have enough people to help defend against the onslaught of the past." Even the temples were powerless due to the sheer magnitude of Yaldabouth's physical and spiritual assault. It was said that time healed all wounds, but Nia was certain that most would suffer from these ones until they went to the gods. "How do you feel about having to come up here to manage things?" Nia asked. "Duty is an honor," Lord Aston intoned. "Though, to be honest, I find it quite enjoyable. I was born and raised to do this sort of thing, but, as a second son, this is probably the closest I'll ever get to having a title in my own right. The royal court should just grant us the damn titles for all the work we've done." Nia and Lord Aston looked over at the entrance of the hall where Lord Lugo was walking in with his entourage. "You know it's not that simple, Lord Lugo," Lord Aston said. "Having southern cadet branches ruling the north will skew the balance of power entirely." As if that hasn't effectively happened already, Lord Lugo snorted as he took a seat on the opposite side of Lord Aston. "It's a double standard, besides. They're dangling rewards over the people to encourage them to perform, yet somehow our good governance isn't counted for that. First, we're de facto rulers of the north, then, we're advising whatever commoners are raised to the post. While we're doing that, we must also educate their children so they can govern on their own. Whoever we're keeping these seats warm for will be Southerners through and through by the end of it." It was difficult to debate his points when he laid them out that way. What once distinguished the North from the South was their degree of exposure to threats from the Abelian Hills and their traditional stance concerning the Crown. With the Abelian Hills no longer a threat and the Crown in its current state, the Holy Kingdom's future aristocratic elite was bound to be more closely knit than ever before. "I think we have to deal with the Royalists before anything else," Nia said. "Indeed," Lord Lugo nodded. "We should start hammering out the details immediately." The first course of lunch arrived and everyone settled in for a long afternoon of discussion and planning. Nia could only thank the gods that their first offensive was starting out quietly enough.